And yeah, so thank you. This is Jeff Miller's idea to put together this series. So thank you to Jeff for organizing most of it. Thank you to Carrie, who's going to be also presenting the next next lecture in the series, and we'll also be monitoring the chat for questions today. So let's get into it. And the reason why we're so interested in identifying these different species and being really accurate with our identification is that weed species respond very differently to management, as you know. Each weed species has different biology, and the timing of which it emerges out of the ground, as this graph shows here, varies widely. And so that's one of the things that I'm going to be harping on today is thinking about when the weed emerges and trying to disadvantage it right from the start. Okay, so having it emerge out of the ground into bare soil with no crop competition is very different than having it emerge with an already emerged crop, well-established crop with some residue on the ground, with plans in place for post-emergence control. They're very different scenarios, and so you can kind of use the emergence timing to improve your management, and I'll talk a lot about that. Obviously, different weed species, just based on the biology of the weeds, respond very differently to management, especially herbicides. This is just a little snippet from a table out of the Mid-Atlantic Field Crop Weed Management Guide, and they do a really nice job showing you which herbicides are the most effective on each weed species, and they have most of our common and problematic weeds in there. I'd really recommend that guide, as well as the Cornell Pest Management Guidelines, which a lot of you probably have already. And Jen, if you could post in the chat the links for those two resources so folks can have that would be great. Okay, so that's why we're looking at identification. That's why it's so important that you really identify it down to the species level, not just, yeah, it's a pigweed, or yeah, it's a bindweed, but which one is it? Because they respond differently to management. So for folks that are kind of pen and paper kind of people, old fashioned like me, I like having my Weeds of the Northeast handbook ready, and you can buy that online a few different places. And I like to keep a little notebook with some special features about each weed, the leaf shape, the flower shape, the overall plant structure, and maybe some notes on management. In fact, so it might be a good place to start today, if you have a pen and paper handy or a notepad, is to maybe take some notes, because I am going to go over a lot of weeds, probably 30, 40 weed species. And I think, if you can make maybe a single note or two about each species, that would be really helpful. But at the same time, I completely understand if you're kind of past pen and paper and you do it all on your phone, that's completely fine too. A few years ago, I was really excited. I organized this Weed ID workshop. All of the registrants, we were able to provide Weeds of the Northeast to all of them. So we passed out 20 or 30 of these books, and we went around. I had weed specimens all around the classroom. Everyone is getting out their books, going through the dichotomous keys. Okay, is it opposite leaf or is it alternate leaf? Going down to the next question. Does it have reddish flowers, or are the flowers yellowish? Going down to the next question. And it's this kind of slow process to identify it. And there was this young couple that came, and they breezed through all 20 species that we had in about 2 minutes. And I said, "What is the deal? How are you so good at this?" And she pulled out her phone. She was using a Weed ID app, and she got all of them correct using this app. So I was really impressed. And I've been using Picture This here and there, and have been also impressed with how accurate it is. You do have to take a good picture with a solid background, like the side of a truck, perhaps, maybe the blue sky. But you've got to have one plant, not a background of green and other plants, and close-ups of the flower or the leaf are really helpful. So not from 10 feet away, but close up. And if you do that, they're pretty darn accurate. Lynn Sosnowski has done some actual trials with them, and found that in her trials they're around 70-80% accurate. In my own experience, they've been a little bit more accurate than that. I think it does depend on the quality of the image that you take. But this is a really big tool, and if you have a smartphone, I definitely recommend checking out these apps. Okay, so starting in on some of the weeds, I'm going to start with summer annuals. So these are weeds, I guess, in most of our spring planted annual crops like corn, soybeans. A lot of our weeds are going to be summer annuals. They come up in the spring and they get bigger over the summer and then set seed and die in the fall. Okay. So for most of these species, I'm going to give you a couple seconds just to kind of jog your memory, see if you know the species, like you can kind of quiz yourself, do you know this? And then I'll pull up the name. This is common ragweed, which is actually one of our earliest emerging species. It just so happened that I put it first in my slides. And I should say thank you to Carrie Marshner for putting together these great slides in this kind of style. I'll be using a lot of these that she's put together for us. And some of the key characteristics of common ragweed are this really finely dissected leaf in the bottom left there. That's one leaf, and it has all these deep lobes and different parts to it. You might think there's 100 different leaves there, but it's just one. And ragweed is the cause of hay fever, so it produces this pollen that a lot of folks are allergic to. And in New York State, it's pretty widespread in a lot of field crops, and it is probably our earliest emerging summer annual weed in New York. So that can kind of help it in some ways. You know, it's the first one up. It can kind of get a head start, so it might be able to survive some of our attempts to control it if it gets itself established early on. But on the other hand, we can kind of use that against it. And that really is its Achilles heel, is that it really finishes up emerging by the end of May. And it won't really emerge in June at all. So if you're able to, on certain fields where you have ragweed, to delay your planting, that means that you'll be able to, hopefully either with a last, final prep with tillage or a final burn down application, you could control this with just about anything before you even have a crop in the ground. So that's a big weak point for ragweed. It's also really susceptible to clopyralid, which you may know as stinger. Okay, next weed. Give you a second. This is hairy Galinsoga, which is actually more of a problem in vegetables, but a few of you did mention it in our registration. I guess it can be a problem in corn and soybeans as well. Very small cotyledons early on, and these tiny white flowers. This was on the bulletin board of one farm I visited. They really respect the competitive nature of this weed and its ability to set seed very quickly. It has a really rapid growth rate, and from emerging to flowering is very quick. I think it's just a matter of a few weeks that it can pop out of the ground and immediately just starts flowering and setting seed, and it can produce seeds throughout the season. And the other thing is that there's no dormancy in the seeds. So those seeds that it makes and drop down to the ground in July, they might germinate immediately and get more plants. So it's just like it can kind of just like compound itself over the course of the season. And if it's uncontrolled, it just keeps setting seed and you get more seed emerging. But on the other hand, we can use that against it. So that's, I think, its Achilles heel, is that there's no seed dormancy. Whenever the conditions are adequate, whenever it has warm soil and reasonably moist soil, it will germinate. So it's very susceptible to stale seed bedding, if you know what that is. So trying to prepare your ground for planting, tillage, level soil, maybe even irrigating or waiting for a nice rain before you plant or after you plant it, or different times during the season. Whenever it fits in, Galinsoga will be emerging because it has no dormancy. And anytime you can get it to emerge, then you can come through and till or spray to basically remove those seeds from your soil. Okay, common lambsquarters. Very distinctive, kind of a lighter green shade. And part of that is that it has these kind of white, powdery looking trichomes on the upper surface of the leaf. And that it does a number of things, but the main thing is that it acts as a sunscreen for the plant. So it keeps it from kind of burning or drying out in hot sun conditions. But common lambsquarters is a big time seed producer, as you probably know. Hundreds of thousands of seeds can come off of a thriving mature plant. It does do best in very fertile, high nitrogen situations. It has this ability, we call it luxurious uptake. It can consume and take up more nitrogen than it needs just to disadvantage the plants around it. So, trying not to over fertilize or being very judicious about putting your fertilizer right in the crop row to not benefit the lambsquarters. There's a few cases of resistance to group 5 herbicides in New York, and this is, I'm talking about WSSA, Weed Science Society of America grouping, mode of action, site of action numbers. And actually, Jen, if you want to share the link to it, I have a chart that would be really helpful for folks to look at. I'm going to mention these WSSA numbers quite a bit, and this chart has a lot of the common herbicides and which group number that they're in a really nice color-coded way. So it's a good thing for you to have and maybe even print out and put in the barn. Okay, so the Achilles heel, and there's not really a really great Achilles heel for common lambsquarters, but the young seedlings are really susceptible to soil disturbance. They're really fragile. So cultivation is a good one for lambsquarters. Also, as I mentioned, because it thrives in the really high nitrogen, highly fertile conditions, it may be best to side dress rather than pre-plant your nitrogen. And you've got to think about that too when incorporating your legumes. If you're just going to be a big incorporation of nitrogen there, you'll probably get a flush after that as well. Okay, next weed. A lot of you probably know this one. It's been pretty problematic the past few years. It's Velvetleaf. Velvetleaf is a very it produces a large seed, and well, let me talk about the ID first. It has these somewhat heart-shaped cotyledons early on that you can see, and that heart-shaped leaf stays true, although it gets a little bit more lobed over the course of the season. But it does have a very fuzzy stem. It's kind of soft to the touch, and produces these kind of distinctive, like crown-shaped seed pods with a large seed. And that large seed helps it emerge from deeper in your soil, so it can push through. If you have a shallowly incorporated residual herbicide, it can kind of push through that quickly in some cases. So it can be difficult if you're just relying on pre's. And then, of course, when it gets older and it gets that velvet on it and the leaves are drooping, when you spray it with herbicide, it'll just kind of run right off. So the uptake isn't very good. And then it has a strong taproot, so it's difficult to cultivate. But it's Achilles' heel, and this is something that I've been reading up on in a recent book by Chuck Moeller and others, is that when you're using crops that are harvested prior to mid-August, you should be okay. And there's not as many of those examples, I guess, in field crops as vegetables. Okay, but you do have winter grains, which can be harvested before that. And because mid-August is when it starts to put on seeds. It's not like Galinsoga that produces seeds continuously. Velvetleaf is one that produces seeds at the very end of the season. So if you can control it before that, or even harvest before that, that's great. And you do have a small window to control it using post-emergence herbicides or cultivation. When the plant has 4 leaves or less, it's very susceptible, or it's at its most susceptible stage. Because those seeds are so large, they'll stay on the soil surface. And actually, a lot of mice and beetles eat those seeds, which can be really helpful and control up to 50% of the seeds sometimes. And it's very susceptible to carfentrazone, which you may know as AIM. Okay, next weed. This is more of a group of weeds that I'm including here. The Smartweeds. So Smartweeds, including pale Smartweed, Pennsylvania Smartweed, lady's thumb. Some of these have a mark on their leaf about halfway. The key with Smartweeds and this family in general, the Polygonum family. If you've seen Japanese knotweed on the side of the road, this is in the same family. It has these joints where the leaves come out, these jointed stems, and there's like a sheath around those joints called the ochrea. That's present in all of our Polygonum species. And Smartweeds emerge in early spring, particularly in moist areas. And because they primarily emerge in early spring, kind of like ragweed, common ragweed, a delayed planting can allow you to use your final pass with tillage or final burn down application to control these before you even have a crop in the ground. And I see a few people have their hand raised. If if you want to pop a question or comment into the chat where we can see it, that would be best. And let's see, I'm able to click on the weeds. Okay, we do have a question from Ryan Marr, and I'll try to answer these questions as I go along. And feel free to interrupt me, Carrie, if there's one that you want to ask live. But Ryan Marr asked, does hairy Galinsoga need light to germinate? Will it germ in no-till soils? That's a good question, Ryan, and I have the answer to that in a resource that I'm going to share at the end of the presentation. I don't remember off the top of my head, though.
The other question was, does soil solarization help control Galinsoga?
I would say yes. Soil solarization, I've done a few trials with solarization, which is more of a more commonly used in small scale vegetables than field crops, but is used on a large scale in California. So who knows, it may be used in New York field crops one day. Soil solarization is using clear plastic to superheat the soil to kill weed seeds in the top few inches. And I've seen it be very successful on basically everything except maybe some very well-established perennial species and common purslane, which I'll talk about later. So yes, I would expect it to be. Okay, closing up the questions box. Did I finish here with Smartweeds? Yeah, so the other thing about Smartweeds is that they are somewhat short stature, and so they may be able to be outcompeted with corn and very competitive crops. And it's also very susceptible to atrazine in general. And I kind of gave this away quickly, but we have a few different nightshades in New York. I think most common are hairy nightshade, which I'm picturing here on the right, and eastern black nightshade. And actually, they look very similar to our horse nettle, except for the spines. And horse nettle is a perennial, which I'll talk about later, also in the tomato, the solanaceous family. But the berries are toxic. And so this can be a big problem in peas because they can't separate the berries from the peas, and they'll reject whole fields because there's just a few of these nightshades in them. But its Achilles heel is that many herbicides are effective on the nightshades, and it's very susceptible to crop competition due to its short stature. So it's not a very competitive weed, or not the most competitive. Unlike this weed, which can really take over if given half a chance. This is a vining weed. This is Burcucumber. It looks a lot like a cucumber or a winter squash, except instead of a nice yellow flower, it has this kind of small cluster that will eventually develop into a small, kind of a spiny little cucumber type fruit. And within that fruit, Burcucumber has 5 to 30 large seeds. And because those seeds are so large, it has the energy to emerge from just about anywhere in the plow layer. So it can emerge from very deep, which can help it get by a lot of residual herbicides again, allow it to escape shallow cultivation. And unfortunately, it's a rather long-lived seed. So, though it doesn't produce many seeds, you're not going to be dealing with the thousands and thousands of them emerging like you would after a bad year with pigweed or lambsquarters. Those that do emerge are more likely to be successful, so they're harder to control. But there are less of them, so there's going to be one here, one there, and just kind of sporadic. So it can be a good candidate for hand roguing. You know, if you can pay some high schoolers to just kind of run through the field and get these out, or if you've got a patch of them, you know, that might be a good tactic. But it is susceptible to glyphosate in our glyphosate tolerant crops. Okay, next weed. This is common purslane. And common purslane has a very distinctive appearance, these thick, waxy leaves, which contain a lot of water and a lot of you know, stored nutrients that can actually really help it survive cultivation or plowing efforts. And that waxy cuticle, I would imagine, makes it kind of difficult to control with herbicides. And as I mentioned earlier, it's actually stimulated by high heat. And this has been the only weed that, when I've used soil solarization in the past, has actually been stimulated and come up under the plastic and kind of seems to enjoy that high heat. But on the other hand, it's shade intolerant. So it's fairly easy to get a good crop going and outcompete this weed, and it stays very close to the ground. So in some ways, it's kind of a good ground cover. Okay, our next weed. This is Jimsonweed, which a few of you mentioned, has a pretty showy flower, a little bit like a bindweed, but with these kind of pointed tips on its 5 sides, and a bigger leaf with more irregular margins to it, and produces a rather spiny fruit at the end of the season. It really thrives in kind of over fertilized conditions. If you've got a field that may be right next to the dairy barn that gets a lot of manure, that's often where the Jimsonweed will be. But when it's very small, it's susceptible to a wide range of corn herbicides and other herbicides as well. And in no-till and residue, high residue systems, it doesn't emerge to the extent that it does in tilled systems. So those are two things you can kind of use to tailor your management. Okay, next weed. And this was honestly a weed that I haven't really dealt with. I'm not sure if there's attendees from other states, but a few people mentioned this, and I just haven't seen it in person. I don't know if it's relatively new to New York, but Santa Maria Feverfew. And it does look similar to ragweed, at least the leaf shape does, but the flowers and the seed heads are very different. It has a little bit larger white flower, and whereas ragweed has that kind of the longer seed head and flowering head on it. It seems to be most problematic in forage systems, even though it is an annual. And I think part of that is that it has some allelopathic compounds that it kind of exudes that hinder the plants nearby, and it's toxic to livestock. So I could see why it's an issue for pasture and folks with livestock. I didn't find a great Achilles heel for this weed, but it is kind of a new one to me, so I'll keep my eye out. There are some biocontrols in development because it is a landscape weed as well. It's taking over some rangeland in South Africa and Australia. So they're working on different biocontrols to kind of release insects or plant pathogens to try to regain control on a larger scale. In the meantime, it does seem to be susceptible to our systemic broadleaf herbicides, like, for example, 2,4-D or dicamba. So perhaps using those in combination with reseeding of grasses and grass forages could be successful. Okay, so a few different pigweeds. First, I'll talk about red root pigweed. Again, thank you, Carrie, for these excellent slides. And a red root pigweed is one that is ubiquitous in New York, and we have a few different pigweeds: smooth pigweed, Powell amaranth. But in general, they're a little bit darker green than a lot of our weeds. The cotyledons, when they're young, you can't really see it here, but there is a visible midrib, unlike some of our other weeds. They look a little bit like a common lambsquarters when they first emerged, these cotyledons, but a darker shade of green. And the cotyledons are a little bit, they're not directly opposite each other. They're a little bit closer on one side, kind of a slant. Red root pigweed is covered in hairs. Unlike some of our other newer problem pigweeds, this is tall water hemp. And I've done quite a bit of work with tall water hemp, and I guess one of the keys to identification is these longer leaves, these narrower leaves compared to our other pigweeds. Again, that darker shade of green, and the stems are hairless. Unlike our other pigweeds, our more common pigweeds, tall water hemp has male and female plants, which we call dioecious. So you can see that some plants have pollen and some plants will produce seeds. And actually, Jen, I've got a few links that I sent you. If you could pop those into the chat. Let's see. Oh, great. Looks like there's a lot going on in the chat for everyone else. If you could pop in those, the results of our trials. We had 2 years of trials on water hemp in corn and soybeans. And these links are to the reports from those data, as well as a video kind of summing everything up. Okay. Palmer amaranth is not as widespread at the moment as water hemp, luckily, but it is in I think 3 counties last I checked in New York, and is a very serious and competitive weed. It produces even more seeds than water hemp, up to 1 million seeds, and I guess its main distinguishing characteristic, okay, like water hemp, it has a hairless stem, but unlike water hemp, when you fold the petiole or the leaf stem over the leaf, the petiole is longer. So that's what we really look for. Sometimes it has a notched tip, it has kind of a poinsettia appearance from the top. But a very serious weed. And so now I'll go over the management. And for all of these pigweeds, they generally emerge a little bit later and kind of in more of a protracted, drawn out pattern than most of our other summer annuals. And that's part of what makes them problematic. You know, they're emerging halfway through or towards the end of the season. So they're maybe only getting you know, a little bit of that residual herbicide. So they're just exposed to a little bit, and maybe they'll survive it. And the ones that aren't able to survive die. So that kind of shifts the population towards those that can resist herbicides by exposing them to these sublethal doses. And so that's part of the reason why we have more resistance issues in these pigweeds. So red root pigweed, I'm not sure if there was any resistance to it. I know that there was a population of it was either red root or smooth pigweed that was resistant or suspected to be resistant to linuron in New York. But tall water hemp and Palmer amaranth, we have several populations that we have sufficient evidence to say that, yeah, it's likely resistant to those Weed Science Society of America herbicide groups 2, 5, and 9 for water hemp, and for palmer 2, 4, and 9. So these, these are some very commonly used herbicides here, unfortunately, and I guess in the trials that Jen mentioned, we found that herbicides in groups 14, 15, and 27 were very effective, especially when you use 2 or more of these effective herbicides on these weeds. But you've got to no longer rely completely. You can still have them in the mix, but no longer rely completely on those products. So Achilles heel, and this is really lucky that we have this. Pigweed seeds don't live a long time in the soil. So if you're able to do a good job with your control for about 4 years, you should be able to, that should remove basically all of the pigweed from your soil. So it's like, yeah, okay, 4 years. I don't know, it's a question of how much do you want to kind of struggle with this weed for the rest of your farming, time that you're doing it on this field, versus spend 4 years and really get down to business. Don't let any of it set seed. If you can do that, you probably won't have it, or will have very little of it in the future. So it's you can kind of go 2 roads. All right, changing it to winter annuals here. I got to speed up a little bit. So got about 15 minutes left. A lot of times winter annuals, so these are weeds that emerge in the fall, and they stay pretty small over the course of the winter, maybe under the snowpack, and then in the spring they'll put on new growth and set seed and then die. A lot of times these aren't problematic, really. They're small, they're low growing. I guess they're most problematic in winter grains because it has the same type of life cycle. But a lot of these are very low growing and not really an issue. One that several of you mentioned is this weed right here, Catchweed Bedstraw, which is a winter annual, and is most problematic in hay and pasture, especially where you have high phosphorus. But for bedstraw, it won't emerge from the depth of moldboard plow. So if you're able to flip that or invert that soil, get the seeds down to the bottom of the moldboard plow layer, it's not gonna be able to emerge from that. And then about half of the seed will die every year. So if you can flip that soil, maybe when you're renovating your hay or your pasture, do some moldboard plowing, then put in your new pasture. It shouldn't be coming up until you're ready to renovate again. And by that point, a lot of it will be dead. Okay, now this is maybe a little bit of a trick weed here. A lot of you are probably going to say mustard, which it is a mustard. It's in the mustard family, but this is actually wild radish, which you can differentiate from wild mustard because wild radish has these constrictions between the seeds in the seed pod there. And those constrictions will continue to get smaller until each of these seeds kind of breaks apart in the seed pod. And that's actually the same size as a lot of our wheat and small grains. So unfortunately, for those of you that are harvesting and doing bin run seeds, this can be an issue because you can't filter out the wild radish. It's the same size. So it's just something to consider. But it does typically emerge in the fall or very early spring. So delaying planting can allow you to avoid the peak emergence of this weed and control it. Control the bulk of the emergence before you even have a crop in the ground. Okay, this is a real problem for some of us. It's horseweed, also called mare's tail. It does kind of look like a mare's tail or like an upside down baseball bat when it's mature. very hairy leaf. And I guess, well, one of the, I guess some folks get it confused with goldenrod. So I actually put together some comparison pictures here. Horseweed leaves are widest towards the tip of the leaf, whereas goldenrod are widest towards the base of the leaf. That's one distinguishing characteristic. Horseweed actually has longer hairs and they're more towards the edge of the leaves. Horseweed has white flowers, and those flowers produce seeds that allow it to proliferate and spread in the wind. So, which actually leads into, there's roots again. Goldenrod is a perennial, so it has extensive rhizome systems. It's connected to the plants around it, typically through the roots. Horseweed is typically resistant to herbicides in groups 2 and 9 in New York, unfortunately. And this is actually a soybean field that horseweed is escape control in. So horseweed, to control it with herbicides, you really have to do so when it's less than 4 inch tall. Kind of the soda can rule. If it's larger than a soda can, it's very difficult to control. And one thing that John Wallace had found was that if you're able to use a winter cover crop, you can keep it to a small size. The cover crop will compete with it and keep it small so that when it comes time to spray in the winter, it will still be controllable. So that's something to consider. But really, I think the main Achilles heel of horsetail is that it has these tiny seeds which have almost no energy. They can barely emerge out of the ground, and only if they're in the top 1/10 of an inch of soil. Okay, so any kind of tillage to bury these will be very effective. And each year, 75% of the seed dies in the soil. So that's a really positive thing that we have going for us if we're trying to control this weed. And as in that Mid-Atlantic Field Crops Guide, actually it listed glufosinate as the most effective herbicide. 2,4-D is effective as well, typically. So biennials, these emerge typically in the spring, put on a fair amount of growth over winter, and then complete their life cycle the following year. Several of you mentioned this weed, which is common burdock. I'm assuming you're in pasture or livestock systems where it can cause a number of problems. You really don't see burdock in annual crops, primarily because of the tillage. But if you are continuing in a pasture system, you might take a look at systemic herbicides, so 2,4-D or glyphosate in the rosette stage. Okay, so before it bolts. Also, possibly in the flowering stage is when a lot of our perennials are susceptible to these systemic herbicides because they're well, I misspoke. Perennials, I mean biennials, before they're putting energy down into their roots to survive the winter. So that's typically in late summer. Okay, several of you mentioned this weed, spotted knapweed, which is also a common landscape weed. You see it on roadsides. It really thrives in dry, low fertility situations, but really in New York, in the past few years, more common than spotted knapweed is becoming meadow knapweed, which is actually a perennial rather than a biennial, and is thriving in our hay fields and likes moist soil. So this is another case where accurate identification is key, and really it comes down to below the flower, there are these sepals that are either black or brown, and that's what you want to look at when distinguishing. And again, you never see knapweed in annual crops or crops with regular tillage. So if that's an option, that is kind of the Achilles heel of knapweed. If that's not an option, there are biocontrols that are being developed, different weevils that eat the roots or different parts of the plant. Faye Benson suggested stomping. How about if you've got a patch of this, well, either set it aside and till it, or if it's really widespread, aggregate the livestock to a very high density and put out some hay bales for them to eat, so which can also reseed the ground at the same time, and allow their footsteps to kind of stomp and trample the young plants before they're flowering and setting seed. So that may be something to think about. Okay, wild carrot looks very similar or somewhat similar. It's in the same family as giant hogweed and wild parsnip, which you need to be careful about if you're going to be touching. Both can burn you, but wild carrot does not burn. It can be problematic in livestock situations. And again, you never see it in crops, in annual crops or where tillage is used. Okay, perennials. So these are around for many years, and typically they'll develop very extensive root systems that allows them to survive the winter. And they put a lot of energy reserves into those roots.
Do you want to flip over to questions? There's just a couple of them before you scroll too much further.
Sure.
Thanks.
Okay. Popped it open for smartweeds. As you said, it is not tolerant to drought. Whether if we delay the irrigation or reduce the quantity of irrigation can suppress this instead of complete drought. Yeah, okay, Carrie. I think Carrie's typing an answer there. Aaron Gabriel, extension educator in Eastern New York, asks, is Purslane competitive and will it really reduce yield? Yeah, not really, as I mentioned. The Weed ID app, the one that I had pictured was called Picture This. And yeah, I really recommend it. So I'm just going to move on quickly. This is Canada thistle. Several of you mentioned this. Oops. One thing, this is kind of funny as an Achilles heel, but goats can eat Canada thistle if they're corralled in very densely. It's also very susceptible to clopyralid, which you may know as stinger. Okay, common milkweed. Several of you mentioned common milkweed, which is an important plant for monarch butterflies, but unfortunately it's toxic to livestock. Again, these perennial weeds, most of them, with the exception of Canada thistle and bindweeds, most of them and maybe quackgrass, which Carrie will talk about, you don't really see them in annual systems with tillage. But if you are if you are trying to stick to hay or a perennial system, they are susceptible to repeated use of systemic herbicides. But it's going to have to be repeated. It takes a long time to deplete or target that root system of these perennial weeds. I'm going to skip over field horsetail. Hemp dogbane, again, it looks a little bit similar to milkweed, and again, can be targeted with regular disturbance or regular mowing in conjunction with fall herbicides. Horse nettle. Several of you mentioned horse nettle, which is very difficult to control with herbicides. On that Mid-Atlantic weed control guide, the ratings from 0 to 10. If 10 is ideal, for almost all the herbicides, it was like 6 for horse nettle. So very difficult to control with herbicides. But rotating or mixing up your crop rotation so that you can have some summer tillage is really going to be very effective on horse nettle. Okay, final weed here. This is field bindweed, which again has a massive root system. They say the center root is actually at the center of the earth. So it can take a lot of years to try to either repeatedly remove the top growth to deplete that root system or target it with systemic herbicides when it's sending resources down to the ground. This is just showing after a few years of herbicides, probably our growth regulators like 2,4-D or glyphosate are going to be most effective. Hedge bindweed isn't quite as tough as field bindweed. And so, there's some different tactics to be used. So make sure you know the difference. Jen, if you could pop into the chat the link that Lynn Sosnowski created about distinguishing the different bindweeds, that would be great. As well as the link to this new book, which is fantastic and it's for free. This is primarily Chuck Moeller's effort, as well as Tony DiTommaso and John Teasdale. A fantastic resource which lists these amazing tables with all of the pertinent information, the stuff that guides your management about how you can utilize the timing and the biology of the weed to improve your management. And it's just fantastic. And a lot of the stuff I'm presenting today is from this book. So do check that out. Scouting apps can be used in conjunction with a lot of this. And for more information, check out our website, which Jen can post a link into the chat. This is all of our weed IPM information. So that's it for most of my talk. If there's more questions, I can continue to answer those from the Q&A tab. But I do want to put in a plug for the rest of the series, and Jen has the link there, which she can put in. Thank you, Jen, for putting in all these links. And now Jeff has some poll questions for us to close us out before we put in our DEC or CCA credit information again.
Hi, folks. Take a couple minutes to answer these 3 questions for us.
Brian, can you look at the restated question in the question and answer?
Yes, okay. Okay, smartweeds are not tolerant to drought. So in that case, just in the quantity of water can make that weed to starve it and it survive from low irrigation. Yeah, so I guess in general, giving your crop an advantage by placing the irrigation, if you can, I guess, in vegetables, we can use drip irrigation in, which might be what you're talking about. But if not, if it's overhead irrigation or rainfall, you're not really going to be using it to target or to try to disadvantage any weed species. I think it can kind of supplement, but it's certainly not going to be the whole or a very significant way to manage weeds. So I guess I'd try to work in some other weed control tactics if you can.
And the polling is done, Brian.